Some monsters are born in darkness, where the light has never walked. Some born in the void, where reality frays. Some monsters are forged in flame, where nothing survives, forged in hate, hammered into cruelty. But a lich? A lich chooses to become a monster, born of fear. Not fear of the dark or of the flame, but the one truth no magic can erase: death. A lich is what happens when the fear of death outweighs the cost of losing everything else. They aren't mindless, they aren't cursed, they choose on death. Wizards who trade their humanity for eternity. And that choice tells us far more about them, and about ourselves, than you might realize. What makes a lich? Is it an undead wizard locked in the phylactery? Or is there something deeper, something more human, more tragic, lurking beneath the surface? Today we're diving into the story of the Lich, tracing its origins from ancient myths to its defining role in Dungeons & Dragons. And along the way, we'll uncover the surprising truths that make Liches far more compelling than D&D gives them credit for. By the end, you might see the Lich in a way you never have before. The Lich we know today owes most of its identity to D&D, first appearing in the Greyhawk supplement for its original D&D rule set. From the outset, the design was surprisingly complete. A very high-level magic user, now an undead skeletal form, sustained by magic. When the Lich appeared again in the AD&D Monster Manual, its concept was expanded. Here, the Lich is given a supra-intelligence, an intellect surpassing even the average genius. The text notes, a Lich exists because of its own desires and the use of powerful and arcane magic. The Lich passes from a state of humanity to a non-human, non-living existence through force of will. It retains this status by certain conjurations, enchantments, and a phylactery. What stands out is how fully formed the archetype already is, an incredibly intelligent, magically exacting figure with the willpower to cheat death, but at the cost of their humanity. That phrase, non-human, non-living, is telling. The phylactery is mentioned but left unexplained. In Jewish tradition, a phylactery refers to a small box containing scripture worn during prayer. In D&D, it borrows from the older, more generic meaning, a protective amulet. This is reinforced in the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide, where items like a phylactery of faithfulness or phylactery of long years appear as wearable magical treasures. The Lich quickly became a mainstay of D&D and TSR's other publications. As D&D influenced wider media, Lich followed. The first Ultima game featured a Lich as one of its toughest enemies. The original Final Fantasy likewise used a Lich as a major boss fight. The trope even crossed into contemporary fantasy satire, with Terry Pratchett's Discworld using Lich as a nickname for a wizard who had magically extended his life. But, and it won't surprise anyone who's watched my videos before, the Lich didn't originate in D&D. The game gave the monster a definitive identity and widespread popularity, but its roots run deeper. Gary Gygax, creator of the Greyhawk setting where the Lich debuted, pointed to two main inspirations. He was an avid pulp-fiction reader, especially fond of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, which often feature malicious sorcerers prolonging their lives through dark magic. The more direct model came from Gardner Fox's series Kothar, Barbarian Swordsman, which includes an undead sorcerer of immense power and intellect. Fox explicitly called this figure a Lich, likely using the word in its older sense of corpse, alongside other synonyms like cadaver. But the resemblance to D&D's Lich runs deeper than the name. The sorcerous extension of unlife, the paralyzing touch, the fear-inducing presence, all of these traits appear in both Fox's work and the OD&D stat block. If we were to chart the Lich's family tree, Fox's character could be considered the first true Lich. But like all monsters, it has even older ancestors, figures from myth and literature that share its core traits. Before we trace those deeper roots, though, it's worth pausing to examine the modern fantasy Lich itself. What exactly are the traits that make it iconic? For half a century, the D&D Lich has remained the same skeletal archmage, powerful, cunning, and immortal, because from the very start the design was nearly complete. But a name and a stat block are only the surface. To understand the Lich's hold on fantasy, we have to strip it down to its bones and examine the traits that define it, and what they cost. Pillars that hold up the archetype across D&D lore. These are recurring patterns that appear no matter which name you pull from the pages. Every Lich is, first and foremost, someone who refuses to die. This immortality is never a gift, but a hard-won prize, paid for with sacrifices that most would find unthinkable. Rituals that bind the soul to a phylactery, pacts with forces that demand unholy obedience, and acts so vile they sever the Lich forever from the natural cycle of life and death. Few embody this more than Vecna, who clawed his way from mortality to undeath through ruthless ambition, sacrificing his own humanity to ensure he could never be undone by the grave. He has ascended to Lichdom, and even minor divinity, returned to life through sheer will and spite, escaped the domains of dread, entered Sigil against the lady's will, and rewritten reality itself. In every way, Vecna is the definitive testament to a Lich's refusal to surrender to death. If a Lich's existence is a declaration, Vecna says, "I will not end." A Lich's unlife is anchored in an unparalleled command of magic. Their power is a culmination of centuries of study, experimentation, and forbidden research, probing into magic so dangerous that most wizards wouldn't dare speak of them aloud. Saz-Tam, Dread Zolkir of necromancy in Thay, wields his power like a master sculptor, bending entire armies of undead to his will, reshaping the land through ritual sorcery, and treating the boundaries between worlds as nothing more than curtains to be drawn aside.
I will command everything quietly and eternally.
And with such power comes time, an eternity to plot, to wait, and to shape the world in silence. Centuries, even millennia, free a Lich from the urgency of the living. Their plots are slow-burning, layered affairs woven so deeply into events that their influence may not be recognized until it's far too late. Larlock, the so-called Shadow King, is a master of such designs. He rarely moves directly, preferring to manipulate from the shadows, setting in motion plans that may take generations to unfold. For a Lich, patience is not a virtue, it is a weapon.
The world bends itself to me, given time.
And yet even the longest lived must feed their ambitions. A Lich's existence is steeped in hunger. This is not a mortal appetite, or one shared by mindless undead. No, this is the drive for more. More magic, more power, more submission from others. Blackith, Lich Queen of the Githyanki, feeds upon the souls of her own people to maintain her reign, and ensure no rival threatens her supremacy. For her, power is not a goal to be reached, but a resource to be devoured, hoarded, and renewed at any cost.
I will take, again, and again, and again.
But this pursuit of more comes with a cost all its own.
I will command
The world
everything
bends
quietly and
Take,
eternally.
again,
given time.
and again,
I will
and
not
again.
end.
Lichdom begins long before the final ritual. It's the slow abandonment of empathy, the deliberate cutting away of every tie that could anchor a person to the living world. Each betrayal, each sacrifice, each cruelty leaves a mark, a stain upon the soul. Vecna's treacherous rise, Saz-Tam's cold dominance, Larlock's manipulations, and Vlaakith's predations all reflect the same truth. To endure forever, a Lich must hollow itself out until nothing remains but will and ambition, a truth that calcifies upon ascension, shaping every choice thereafter. In D&D, this truth is literalized in the phylactery, or spirit jar, which traps the Lich's soul outside the body. What remains inside is only a shell, animated by intellect and power, but emptied of the very thing that once made it human. However, these traits aren't the invention of a game designer's pen. They are echoes, shadows of older stories, whispered warnings about those who'd rather shatter the laws of life and death than obey them. And if you trace those shadows, you'll find the Lich's ancestor in ancient myth. Sorcerers who sealed their souls away in monsters born not from nature, but from choice. One of the most popular Slavic folktales is that of Koshchei the Deathless. This tale echoes Lichdom. Across versions, Koshchei is always the villain who kidnaps the hero's loved one. To defeat him, the hero must discover and destroy his hidden death, typically contained in nested objects: a needle inside an egg, inside a duck, inside a hare, inside a chest, often buried beneath a tree on a well-guarded island. The hero's quest revolves around discovering and destroying this externalized soul to finally defeat him. Koshchei embodies traits familiar to any D&D Lich: immortality achieved through artificial means, cunning, patience, and moral ruthlessness. Unlike most D&D Liches, he rarely wields magic. His power comes from obsession and the careful safeguarding of his life. This tale is part of a widespread folklore motif: the soul, or life force, externalized to achieve immortality, and it is found across cultures. It even appears in earlier stories, such as the giant who had no heart in his body, where a giant removes his own heart to escape mortality. This motif has likely been passed down through centuries of oral tradition. Stories like Koshchei's show that the fear of death and the desire to cheat it are universal, that death is inescapable, and that some will twist life itself to evade it. But what happens when that fear is faced head-on, not hidden away? In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest recorded stories in human history, we find a king who seems larger than life. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, is powerful, ambitious, and oppressive. So much so that the gods intervene, sending Enkidu, a wild man, to humble him. Their clash turns into friendship, and the two set out on adventures together. But once they cross those same gods by killing a sacred creature, Enkidu is struck dead. For Gilgamesh, this loss is devastating. The death of his companion forces him to confront something he cannot fight, cannot charm, cannot outrun: his own mortality. He begins a desperate quest for eternal life. He travels to the end of the earth, searching for the secret of immortality. He pleads, he bargains, he suffers, and in the end, he fails. The gods deny him, reminding him that death is the lot of mortals, a boundary that cannot be crossed. For Gilgamesh, this is a bitter truth. No matter how strong, no matter how clever, no matter how desperate, mortality cannot be outwitted. And yet that failure makes him something more. He returns to Uruk not with immortality, but with perspective, an appreciation for the walls his people built, for the city that will outlast him, for the fleeting brilliance of a mortal life. The lesson is hard-won, but it makes him a better king and a better human. And yet, what if you refuse that lesson? What if mortality were optional? Something to bend, cheat, or ignore entirely? That refusal is Dorian Gray. Dorian is a handsome young lad from Victorian London who sits for a portrait painted by artist Basil Hallward. Dorian wishes that he could stay forever young while the portrait ages instead. Mysteriously, his wish comes true. Dorian remains physically youthful and beautiful, but the portrait begins to change, reflecting the corruption of his soul. Every immoral act and cruel decision he makes is etched into the painting's features. Dorian lives a life of indulgence and vice without fear of physical consequences. His relationships crumble, he ruins lives, yet his own face stays innocent while the painting grows hideous. When Basil confronts him about the rumors of his corruption, Dorian shows him the portrait, then murders him to keep the secret. The painting becomes more grotesque with each act of cruelty. In guilt, Dorian hopes for redemption and tries to live a better life, but he realizes his motives are selfish and that redemption is not possible while the portrait exists. In desperation, Dorian stabs the painting to destroy it, but the magic reverses, leaving Dorian an aged, withered corpse on the floor, and the portrait restored to its original beauty. The portrait of Dorian Gray calls to the motif of Koshchei and the idea of the externalized soul, and demonstrates that immortality comes with a heavy moral cost. Koshchei, Gilgamesh, Dorian, they all show the stakes of mortality and the soul. Life, empathy, reflection, these depend on accepting death. Refusing it, seeking eternal life at any cost, demands abandoning those qualities. The price to Lichdom is paid with your humanity. This is what makes the Lich compelling. Its magic, its cunning, its ambition. These are the outward signs of a decision to give up the very thing that makes a person human, to trade empathy, mortality, and moral accountability for endless existence. And that's the heart of the matter. The Lich makes a good enemy because it's powerful and ambitious. Its plans stretch for millennia unseen, and it commands armies of the dead and magics unknown. But it's terrifying and tragic because it has chosen to discard the part of itself that connects it to life, to other people, and to the world. In doing so, it becomes a detached mirror of what we lose when we try to escape the inevitability of death. What the rules can't always show, and what the stat block cannot capture, is the cost, the erosion of humanity. The Lich is defined by the humanity it leaves behind, but translating that into a monster that players can actually feel is harder than it sounds. Since D&D hardly ever plays with the idea, if you want to add that emotional and thematic weight to your game, we need to use other media as an example. Destroying the phylactery before facing down the Lich to put them to bed for good is common, but it's hardly ever drummed up for the theme, the representation of the phylactery as the divorcing of humanity. How about an example where the idea was on the nose in a swashbuckling adventure that just screams D&D?
Do you feel death?
Davy Jones, the main antagonist of the Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy, is one such case. At first, Jones is framed as a natural force, a Grim Reaper-like figure who ferries souls to his locker. He wields supernatural command over his ship, the Kraken, and an undead crew of sailors that have been fused with sea creatures. But Jones isn't the only Lich-like figure here. Jack Sparrow, the trickster protagonist, spends much of the story grappling with his own mortality. His fear of death drives him to pursue immortality, much like Gilgamesh. And as with Gilgamesh, Sparrow's eventual redemption comes not from escaping death, but from learning to accept it. Jones, however, represents the opposite path.
Many things you were, David Jones, but never cruel. You have corrupted your purpose.
He succumbs to despair and severs his humanity, literally cutting out his heart after betraying his love, Calypso. That heart becomes his phylactery, the vessel of his soul and the anchor of his undeath. So long as it beats, he cannot be destroyed. Ultimately, his defeat follows the classic Lich pattern, the destruction of the phylactery. Once his heart is pierced, Jones is undone, vanquished by striking at the external soul he tried to hide away.
Calypso.
Excuse the gloom, but none may know of this meeting.
In the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, Lichdom is woven directly into the central conflict. At the heart of the story lies the Numidium, a colossal golem built in the mythic past to reshape the world. To control it, two artifacts are required: the Totem of Tiber Septim and the Mantella, a soul gem of unimaginable power. Whoever commands these could bend reality to their will. It's no surprise then that one of the major contenders for this power is Mannimarco, the king of worms and the first of the Undying Liches. Here, he's not lurking around in Imperial City sewers or in some crypt, but playing the great game of Empire. He manipulates royalty, barters souls, and schemes in the shadows, all to secure the Mantella. His goal is to ascend into godhood itself. Mannimarco is Lichdom at its most archetypal, the lust for power carried to its ultimate conclusion, no matter the cost. But opposite him stands another Lich-like figure, the Underking. To most of Tamriel, the Underking is little more than a boogeyman, said to command the restless dead. The legends say the Underking gave up his heart, and without it, he can neither live nor die. Some claim that he hunts endlessly for that missing heart, his agents moving unseen across the land. Behind the myth lies truth. The Underking was once Zurin Arctis, Imperial battle mage to Emperor Tiber Septim. It was Arctis who bound his life force, his heart, into the Mantella, the great soul gem that powered the brass god Numidium. When the Numidium turned from tool of unification to weapon of oppression, Arctis destroyed it, dying in the process before he could reclaim his heart. Without it, he rose again as the Underking. Unlike Mannimarco, the Underking doesn't seek domination or divinity. He longs for release. His struggle isn't about the clinging to power, but surrendering it, to finally lay down the burden of undeath and rest. In Daggerfall, this creates a striking juxtaposition. Within the same conflict, the same chase for the Numidium, we see two faces of Lichdom, the Lich as tyrant, and the Lich as tragedy. Other games blur these categories together.
Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, and his faithful knights.
In Dark Souls, Gwyn is not an undead sorcerer in the classic sense, but he embodies the same desperate descent. When the Age of Fire began to fade, Gwyn sacrificed his own soul to kindle the first flame. He succeeded in delaying the end, but at the cost of burning himself hollow. By the time the player meets him, Gwyn is no longer a king, or even a man, but a charred husk mindlessly swinging his sword. His so-called immortality is really just an endless prolonging of ruin, a tyrant unable to let go of an age where he ruled. In Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree, Miquella undergoes a quieter, but equally horrifying transformation. Known as the Kind, he was beloved for his compassion and his dream of creating a world free from suffering. But in pursuit of that dream, Miquella strips away his own humanity, piece by piece, abandoning his mortal form, divesting himself of need, of connection, of the very vulnerabilities that tied him to others. He doesn't become a lich, but the path is familiar. He casts off his humanity in pursuit of a higher, eternal design, and in doing so, loses the very self he sought to save others with. Unlike Gwyn, who clings to the past, Miquella clings to a vision of the future. But both illustrate the same tragic tyranny, the same refusal to accept the limits of life. Neither of these characters are liches, but they embody the same fusion of tragedy and tyranny. Beings who become monstrous not because they are wholly evil, but because they cannot let go, clinging to the past or forcing their own vision of the future. And that's the key insight. A lich doesn't have to be a power-hungry tyrant. It can be a figure defined by grief, by obsession, by ideals carried too far. Take the bones of Gwyn or Miquella, and you have the template for a lich whose humanity still lingers in the shadows of their monstrosity.
I'll make the world a gentler place.
And then there is Adventure Time's Lich, simply called the Lich. He is an inversion of the trope we've been tracing, but not for the reason you might expect. The Lich is the most ruthless enemy in the series, with no hesitation to destroy and corrupt. Yet there is no tragedy behind him, because there was never a person there to begin with. He was never mortal, never human, never a wizard who severed his soul to achieve immortality. He never made that fateful choice to become a monster. Instead, the Lich is something more primal, a fundamental cosmic force, the embodiment of entropy and annihilation. This Lich does not embody the theme of destruction. He is destruction, pursuing the end of existence through manipulation and raw power. In this sense, the Lich lacks one of the archetype's defining traits, the deliberate severing of humanity. And yet, paradoxically, humanity is what defeats him.
Fall. You are strong, child, but I am beyond strength. I am the end.
After all his manipulations, after the near total unraveling of creation, at the cusp of his victory, the Lich is splashed with the blood of a Citadel Guardian, a substance that can regrow flesh from bone and heal any wound. The result is the Lich reverts to a baby-like figure. Instead of obliteration, he is given a chance to live. Where most Liches lose their humanity to become monsters, this one is defeated by being forced into humanity. So what, after all, makes a Lich? If we look across games and stories, the figure can be many things. The wizard who seeks immortality and loses their soul, king who clings to a dying fire, even the embodiment of entropy. But at their core, Liches are like any other monster. They are mirrors held up to our fears about mortality, ambition, and the human refusal to accept limits. And maybe that's why the Lich endures, because whether they are tragic kings, corrupted scholars, or cosmic forces, they remind us that to deny death is to deny life. That the real monster is not the bones, not the magic, not the phylactery, but the refusal to accept what it means to be human. A Lich, at its heart, is a meditation on mortality, on the danger of trying to master death rather than live life within its limits. And maybe that is the tragedy that keeps the archetype alive. Those Liches remind us endings are not flaws in the design, but part of what gives life its shape, its urgency, and its meaning.